Fontana Dam isn't just a structure. It's a dividing line in the history of this region. Rising from the narrow gorge of the Little Tennessee River, it created one of the largest man-made lakes in the southeast, swallowing entire valleys in the process. What looks today like a sprawling, peaceful body of water came at a cost. Homes, churches, graveyards, and whole communities were erased beneath its surface. The creation of Fontana Lake reshaped western North Carolina forever, and like so many families here, my own was touched by what was lost. The dam brought electricity, jobs, and wartime necessity. But it also displaced generations of people who were forced to leave land their families had worked for decades. Roads vanished. Towns disappeared. What remained were fragments, place names, stories, and memories passed down long after the water rose. Even now, when the lake is low, traces of those former lives sometimes reappear along the shoreline. But Fontana Lake didn't erase everything. In the decades since its creation, something else has quietly become part of the area's history. Reports of strange encounters, sightings, sounds, figures moving along the water's edge have surfaced from hunters, fishermen, boaters, and locals who spend time in the coves and forests surrounding the lake. Some of those encounters happen near old roadbeds now submerged. Others along the remote shorelines, where the forest presses right up against the water. Bigfoot stories tied to Fontana Lake tend to surface in its quietest corners, along narrow coves, steep shorelines, and forested stretches that are difficult to reach without a boat or a long hike. Instead of clear sightings, many accounts describe sounds, heavy knocks echoing across the water, low howls rolling through the ridges, and movement heard just beyond the tree line. In a place where water and mountains distort distance, those sounds can feel deliberate, almost paced, traveling along the lake's edge. It's here, in the overlap between flooded history and untouched wilderness, that Fontana's reputation for strange encounters has slowly taken shape. As the land changed, the wilderness adapted. And if Sasquatch exists in these mountains, Fontana may not be a barrier at all, but another corridor. A place where deep water, steep terrain, and isolation come together. Hiding both what was lost and what might still be out there.
I'm Mark Muncy. I'm the author of the Erie, Florida book series, Erie, Florida, Freaky Florida, and Creepy Florida. And then I ran out of adjectives, so they finally let me leave the state, and I got to go back to my homeland, which is West Virginia and Kentucky, and then the Smoky Mountains. So I got to do Erie, Appalachia, which became a bestseller. And now we are doing deep dives into the Smoky Mountains. So my newest book is Dark Side of the Smoky Mountains, but then I really love digging down into the hollers and the coves and getting all the Meemaw and Peepaw stories and digging into that. And then of course, native cultures and indigenous cultures. I've found stuff as early as the 1700s, late 1700s, right as we were forming. There's some Tennessee articles of a wild man chase. There was a posse formed to find him. Especially if you tie in some of the stuff that goes even further south. One particular in this area, I love the term wood boogers and boogers, but there's one that comes out of Waynesville area, and he's called the Boojum. And this is one of my favorite stories. Again, this isn't really a newspaper article one, this is a word of mouth one. And the story goes with him that he fell in love with a girl, a human girl. And the Cherokee say it was a princess. The settler version is it's a girl who worked in a hotel. The Cherokee version was the Cherokee chieftain said, you can't marry Our Lady unless you're bringing something to the table. And what we want are gems. And this is the gem capital of the world. People don't realize that North Carolina found some of the biggest emeralds and rubies of all time. We came here for gold because the Spanish said there were gold here, but there wasn't, but they found rubies and gems. He's looking for gems, and he sees these men coming out of the caves with gems. He's like, oh, I can do that. So he goes in there, starts digging. It's a lot of work. But then he sees the miners go into town, and they trade these gems for this stuff. And then they come back with these big jugs. They drink lots of jugs and then pass out. So I love a story about a cryptid that likes moonshine and gems. I mean, it doesn't get better than this. And the story goes, according to the Cherokee, he got to marry the princess. And the princess was actually of European descent. The story goes, she married the Boojum, and they lived happily ever after. Neat version of the story. The settler story doesn't have a happy ending, sadly. The girl who works at the inn, her name was Annie, and she would holler to the Boojum to tell him it was safe to come. So she'd make a whoop, which is like the Bigfoot whoop, right? It's the hoo, hoo. And then the Bigfoot would holler back, Boojum would holler back, and that's when they knew it was safe to meet. And then he would still bring gems to her. But the innkeeper was very upset that this Boojum was scaring his guests and all that. So according to the story, he killed the Boojum. But she still goes out hooting for him. Annie keeps going out, hoot, 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 but he doesn't call back. But that's supposedly where we get the term hootenanny.
The Smokies have always been a place for stories. Even as the landscape changed through forced removal during the Trail of Tears, the arrival of white settlers, and later industrial reshaping, the old lore endured. The name shifted, the explanations changed, but the idea remained the same. These mountains were never empty. In the late 1800s, newspapers across western North Carolina occasionally carried reports of what they called wild men. In the 1880s, residents in Macon County described a large, hair-covered figure moving through fields at night, stealing livestock and frightening families enough that armed posses were formed to hunt it down. Around the same time, accounts from the mountains near Asheville spoke of a powerful, man-like creature seen crossing roads and moving upright through the timber, often disappearing before anyone could get close. These stories weren't framed as legends. They were treated as real problems, something loose in the woods that people didn't know how to deal with. By the early 1900s, similar reports continued. In 1909, farmers in Watauga County claimed a mountain wild man was roaming the high country, leaving oversized tracks and terrifying livestock, prompting newspapers to speculate wildly about its origin. Whether blamed on a feral human a strange animal, or something unknown, the description stayed remarkably consistent. Tall, fast, hair-covered, and deeply unsettling. And that consistency matters. Local lore isn't separate from the history of these mountains. It is part of it. These stories survive displacement, settlement, and modernization because they're rooted in lived experience. Passed down, reshaped, and retold. They form a shadow history of Western North Carolina. One that suggests the land has always held more than what's visible at first glance.
Yeah, there's quite a few of those. We learned after 2020, people are willing to open up a little more about this stuff. People are a little less, I'm going to be ridiculed. I can talk a little more. As when I was doing Erie Appalachia, a lot of Mi'kmaq and Peepaws suddenly started sending me letters about the strangest stuff. We got one that I think, sends shivers down my spine, and I get goosebumps every time I think about it. So here we go. I'm allowed to tell it, so it's okay. I'm just not supposed to mention the family and exactly where it's at. But it is along the Balsam Trail, which is a wonderful natural trail up here. It links up with the Appalachian Trail a couple times, named after naturalist William Bartram. There's a family, lives out there in one of the coves, which is like a holler everywhere else. They call them coves here in North Carolina. And this cove, family lives out there a couple generations. They have a wise man of the woods, a big guy out there is what the family called him, the big guy. And they leave him offerings. They put out just some rocks, some things, kind of like a fae offering, usually peanut butter, apparently. And the animals around here love peanut butter. But what they do for him is they leave it in the jar with the lid closed so that way the other animals don't get it. And they would find a big thumbprint in it or stuff like that. Well, they had a Bigfoot hunter come out and say, all right, I'm going to track this thing. I'm going to find it for you. And they're like, okay, just don't bother him because he's our friend. He takes care of us. And they put it out there and something dug into the thing. The hunter went out after it, tried to follow the tracks. Hunter doesn't come back for like 2 days. You're like, well, maybe he's still tracking it. They don't really go to the police or anything just yet because he told them he might be gone sometime. Well, 3 days pass. And they're like, okay, 3 days, that's a missing persons case, so we better call somebody. And police come out, they tag his truck, they put him as a missing persons, please look for him. They call the wildlife investigators, they call all this stuff. Next day he shows up. They don't know how he got into their house, but he's there. And there's mud everywhere. And there's the peanut butter jar right next to him. And it's like, what? It got in his house. They got in their house. It got in their stuff. And when they asked the guy what happened, he was like, I found him. And then he took me in and carried me here. I was hurt. And he carried me here. It took a couple days to get here, but he carried me here. He doesn't remember much. He was in and out of it. Couldn't tell you where he brought him. Couldn't do any of that. That guy no longer Bigfoot hunts, which is amazing to me. And he won't go on the record about this. He won't talk about it, but he quit Bigfoot hunting. He was pretty prominent in the area, but not anymore.
Sooner or later, every trail you follow leads back to the same truth. This region has been shaped as much by human decisions as it has by rivers and ridgelines. I'd heard about Fontana since long before I'd ever visited the Bryson City area. When I was young, my dad was friends with a man named Irvin Welch. Similar to my grandpa Breedlove, who had grown up in western North Carolina, the Welch family had migrated north to the Canton, Ohio area at some point. The Welches had lived in a community in North Carolina called Proctor that now rests at the bottom of what is today Fontana Lake. A fate that met many small communities in the region. To understand what Fontana became and what it cost, I wanted to speak with Lance Holland. Lance has spent years documenting the past of this corner of western North Carolina. He's authored multiple books on local history, including Fontana, A Pocket History of Appalachia, and the Nantahala River, a historian guide. Work that's become essential reading for anyone trying to understand this region beyond the postcard version. Even though he didn't grow up here, people still talk about him like one of the keepers of the region's memory, because he's done the work, listened to the stories, and preserved what would have otherwise disappeared. Fontana Dam and the lake behind it weren't built because someone wanted a scenic reservoir. They were built out of wartime necessity and industrial demand. In the early 1940s, the Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, needed enormous amounts of electricity to ramp up aluminum production for the war effort, and the Tennessee Valley Authority stepped in to build what would become the tallest dam in the East, deep in a remote Little Tennessee River gorge. Alcoa had already been tied to hydroelectric projects in this region for decades, and the Fontana site became the centerpiece, power generation on a massive scale, with consequences that would ripple through every community in the valley. That's where Lance comes in, because the story of Fontana isn't just concrete and turbines. It's families relocated, graveyards moved, towns erased, and a region forced to decide what progress meant when it arrived at your front door. As Lance explains what happened here, why it was built, how locals responded, and what was lost beneath the water, you start to understand how a single dam reshaped the identity of an entire place. How did the creation of the Fontana, the dam, did that impact the Little Tennessee heavily? Did it impact it at all? Like, how did it actually?
Well, it turned part of it into a lake.
Yeah.
I mean, that's.
What about, how did it impact like communities that were, along
There
the
were
river?
there were several communities that were flooded. Mm-hmm. There was the town of Fontana at the mouth of Eagle Creek. There was another one, a little one called Wayside. There's a map in my Fontana book that shows you all of them. None of them were very big. None of them had a population probably of over 100 people maximum.
What did they do with cemeteries and things like that?
It was up to relatives what they did with it. At TVA expense, you could have the grave removed and reburied in what they called a reinterment cemetery. TVA would dig up the body, and then you could transport it to any cemetery you wanted to at your expense. Or you could just leave them there. And quite a few were just left there. During the Great Lake Drawdown in 1990, Danny Olinger, the TVA archaeologist, and I explored the old town of Judson, which was one of the bigger ones. Bushnell was probably the largest, and Judson was probably next. We had the TVA land acquisition map, but we couldn't quite place where we were at. Right. And then we found the graveyard, and there was graves, or gravestones. In 1990, they did they draw Fontana down about 50 feet every year. That's normal procedure. But in 1990, they drew it down about 150 feet, which was the first and actually only time they did that. Yeah. But that was the only time that the old town of Judson came out of the water, since it had been covered up in 1945.
What do you think is, I mean, obviously, like, there's a loss of buildings and things like that, but beyond that, culturally, what do you think we lose or was lost when those villages or communities were basically flooded out?
Well, it was a total change of your way of life. Mm-hmm. That was happening a lot during that period. Yeah. So it wasn't that unusual. And Fontana in particular was pitched as, and truly was, part of the war effort. Mm-hmm. That's what that dam was built for. Okay. Well, first of all, to buy the land, TVA appraisers went around and established a price for it. And there was no price bargaining. Mm-hmm. You either took what they said they were going to give you, or they condemned the land and took it anyway. Okay. The average price paid for the 68,291.97 acres, which were eventually purchased, was $37.76 per acre. The transfer of these tracts was accomplished by 88.4% of the landowners selling voluntarily at the appraised price, 8.2% by condemnation in order to clear up title problems, and only 3.4% by condemnation because the owners refused to sell.
Okay.
People were very patriotic then. There was a reason for giving this stuff up, was to win the war.
Right.
That's another point that I try to get across, is we've got all these wonderful Great Lakes up here in western North Carolina. Why? Only the National Lake Assessment of 2014 determined that less than 1%, there are no natural lakes in the southern Appalachians.
Why?
The answer is there was no glaciation.
Okay.
That's what created depressions that came down to a point pushing earth in front of it, which made a dam basically. And then so when the ice melted, those things filled up with water. Alcoa and the aluminum industry in general was faced with, do you take the raw materials to this power source, or do you take the power source to where the raw materials are? So it was determined that it would be better to take the raw materials to the point where there is good, cheap electricity. So the first Alcoa plant was at Niagara Falls, where they had good hydroelectric, cheap. And then they started this grand search all over North America looking for their great powered bonanza. And what they found was the Little Tennessee River, this great mountain river, plenty of water, plenty of fall, and very sparsely populated. Swain County knew about Alcoa's plans to build this dam, which would have flooded out the old Tennessee River Turnpike, which was the only road access, which was right down next to the river. So then when everything changed with Pearl Harbor, TVA's new lake would flooded out most of the new road that Swain County had just built. And it was during the war. The War Productions Board said that even if TVA had the money, that the materials to build another road and the labor is not available during the war effort. That 46,000 acre tract, which is the North Shore, and that's where a great number of the cemeteries that are left over there, because there was a lot of cemeteries that were just cut off from access. And part of the 43 agreement was after the war, when funds became available, that a new North Shore road would be built from Fontana Dam to Bryson City, and 6 miles of it was built. That's the road to nowhere here.
This is my second time visiting the road to nowhere. The last time I was here, it felt like a monument to something unfinished, a promise made and quietly abandoned. This time it felt different. Something Lance had said to me earlier kept replaying in my head. He'd explained that when Fontana Dam was built, many locals viewed it as a patriotic duty, that the country was at war, power was needed, and sacrifice was simply part of the moment. According to that version of the story, anger wasn't the dominant emotion. People understood what was being asked of them.
I've always framed it the way it's been presented to me, which is that essentially people were kicked out of their homes.
Well,
there was a great deal of resentment. So I don't know if you can speak to that, but that's kind of the understanding a lot of people have regarding Fontana.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that feeling is being perpetuated still.
Okay. Wow.
But in the case of Fontana, it's just not true.
It's not true,
But that idea didn't sit easily with everything else I'd heard over the years, so I wanted more voices. Local voices, modern voices, people who grew up in the shadow of the lake and inherited the stories, whether they wanted them or not. That's why I asked Micah Hanks, Dakota Waddell, and Jeff Smith from the Sasquatch Tracks podcast to meet us here, along with Micah's brother Caleb, who hosts a podcast called Ghosts in the Mountains, and my good friend and mountain brother, his way of describing our relationship, Jeff Carpenter. Not just to talk about Bigfoot, but to talk about Fontana itself. What it means now, how it's remembered, and whether those early feelings of patriotism ever told the whole story. Standing here at the end of the road, surrounded by forest and concrete, it felt like the right place to ask whether the past was really as unified as it sometimes sounds, or if the truth, like so much in these mountains, is far more complicated.
We were talking about like the road to nowhere in Fontana and all this.
Yeah.
Everything I've read regarding Fontana is that there's a lot of resentment locally for it and all this kind of stuff. He says there isn't. So I'm curious to hear what you guys think of that, because his claim was that people were happy to voluntarily give up their land and their homes because it was aiding in the war effort.
Well, I think that there certainly was an element of like being patriotic about that at the time, because it was like when World War II started. And again, I'll just say right off the bat, I am not a historian about this, but I have looked into it, for the podcast that I do. Yeah. And I think initially people were like, hey, we're helping in the war effort. This is going to be very helpful. In hindsight, and the reason that the road to nowhere is a thing, to this day, is because essentially, there's a sign down the road that says, the road to nowhere, a broken promise, essentially, and that's exactly what it was. They were promised that when they evacuated all of their, family plots and all this land that they gave up, which they also subsequently, unfortunately, were offered almost no money. I mean, even for back then, the compensation was laughably bad. But they were promised that the road to nowhere was going to give them access to be able to see their family plots, their family graveyards, and all that stuff. Well, that was never done. Yeah. And some of the reasons that the government gave as to why they didn't put that together or finish the project was, well, because there were, potential environmental problems that were, going to endanger the environment around here. So that was something that I don't think everybody really swallowed. But, after the fact, obviously, I think the resentment grew because, well, if you want to go visit your family plot, you literally have to take a boat to get there to this day. And I think that some entity around here, I don't know if it was the National Park Service or whoever, but they actually started, I think in 2018, to start taking people on boats to go be able to visit those plots. So initially, maybe not so much resentment. Today, probably still some lingering.
Okay,
I mean, how would you feel, right? If you were told, hey, your whole community, your house, everything, you got to leave it behind. Got to be underwater.
Well, they've been promised the road since the 40s. And I think it's by the early 70s, only 7 miles of the road had even been built. And they kept coming up with the excuse of well, we can't get the funding, we can't get the funding. And I think it was in the early 2000s, former Governor Jesse Helms actually said that he got the funding for the road. And by that time, there'd been a pretty intense environmental impact statement made that said if they did continue to build the road, that the environmental impact would be long-term, major, and detrimental. And they actually ended up, National Park Service ended up settling for a few $1 million for I think it was around $50 million. So.
And on the ecological side of it, there probably is an argument to be made, but again, in later decades about that, because there probably wasn't the awareness when the project initially was undertaken that today we have about, the destruction of ecological, actually really ecosystems, the damage that's being incurred by different indigenous species, the incoming invasive species that are now entering this region because of the changes to everything from the waterways to the forest, and of course as a result of deforestation. So I mean, all those impacts probably did become a greater concern, which were highly influential in staving off what eventually became the so-called broken promise.
Yeah.
So the Tuckasegee and the Nantahala being rivers flowing into the main waterway, of course, which serves Fontana Lake, when they build the dam, there's literally a 9.3 mile stretch that ends up being circumvented. And so initially the primary impact right there is there's a whole stretch of what was once the original river that is no longer a waterway. And this is going to directly impact the environment, the creatures that are living there. Probably not a major concern at the time. So that's a major issue, but of course that's also going to be impacting not only the deposition of sediment further downstream, the natural flow of the water. There was an injection of colder water, which again disrupted the life cycles of certain species, but again made it more accessible, we might say, in recent years to certain varieties of invasive species that have made their way here, either by accident or some that have just come into the area, some that were introduced for sport fishing, for example. So there were a range of different impacts. I would really point primarily to that stretch of land that was impacted and the circumvention of that natural waterway. That would be one of the key changes to the environment as a result of the Fontana Dam.
There's a conversely to that. But, what is the conversely? Well, one of the things that was the idea, so the TVA came about as part of FDR's New Deal stuff. So by that time, the logging had become so extensive as well that you were starting to have erosion, crop failure, and one of the goals, not only behind building the dams, was a reforestation project. So they did add trees.
That's true.
But at what cost? Because by that time too, I think in the 30s and 40s, the environmental impact was one of the last things on their mind compared to, you're talking about an economically depressed region already on the heels of the Great Depression. So the New Deal comes around and the idea is let's get people back to work. Then the war happens too, so now you're able to provide power as well. So the sedimentation deposits on the 5 dams that they built down the Little Tennessee, that wasn't a concern now, but it's like a friend of mine was talking about last night. He's a geologist. When it comes to like damming up a river, it's either you learn to live with silt or you learn to dredge. It's one or the other. Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, that was one byproduct that came with the TVA projects, was a lot of reforestation and improved crop growing methods. It wasn't as bad as, say, it was the Dust Bowl. We had, the locals hadn't completely stripped all the land, but it's also, there's how many songs are written about the fact that you can't grow grow corn up here because the soil's too rocky. But there's a lot of truth in that too.
So I do a podcast called Ghosts in the Mountains, and it's everything paranormal around the Western North Carolina region. And we did an episode not too long ago all about this, the Fontana Dam, the creation of it, and the road to nowhere. And one of the stories that I thought was kind of interesting was apparently these people came up here to do just that, like do a paranormal investigation of the tunnel here. Right. And as people kind of do when they start doing paranormal investigations, they kind of start trying to make contact with the entities that are there. And as the story goes, that my associate Austin Burgess on the podcast found, these people go into the tunnel and they start essentially saying, if anybody's there that would like to communicate with us, please make yourself known. And I think they had some prior knowledge about this story of some children that used to hang out up here and like dance in the tunnel. But apparently, after they, put that request out there, it wasn't long after that, they said 2 glowing blue orbs started to move around and kind of dance around one another in the middle of the tunnel here. And they tried to get them on camera, but they wouldn't show up on camera. But they said they watched these orbs just dancing around one another multiple times. There's also some other stories about people being up in the tunnel and maybe getting like touched or grabbed by something that isn't there, but I don't know, who knows? I've never really actually been into the tunnel, so.
Yeah. Caleb, something really unusual about the description you give of those objects those people saw, what they called orbs, was the story that Travis, the gentleman I met earlier this year, told. And in fact, it was pretty close to this region where he and his wife had been camping one night. They were doing primitive camping. They had their dog with them. And they said that they saw initially what they thought was somebody with a headlamp coming up the trail toward them. And he said, great, we're gonna have somebody in the middle of our camp. They weren't happy about this. As the light gets closer and closer, he says, okay, and the hiker with the headlamp is coming right through our campsite. Once the light gets close enough, he says it's a little softball-sized bluish-white orb of light that's hovering at about, the same level that you'd expect a person's head to be, and it moves directly through their campsite. The dog doesn't react. His wife is scared, but he's telling her, are you seeing this? Are you watching? And he made her watch to make sure he wasn't imagining this. And he says this little light just goes right on through their camp, right up the ridge, and on up until they couldn't see it any longer. And he says, have you ever heard of a story of a UAP like that? And I said, I would call that UAP, but the question of what exactly it was, what was the cause, I don't know. But you do hear those stories, and again, it sounds almost like somebody may have seen something like that in the tunnel here.
Yeah.
Seth, you ever hear stories of feral humans here in the Great Smoky Mountains?
Yeah, from you.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been tracking those for a long time. But it seems that a lot of it's probably more in the realm of myth than reality. There are some compelling stories, though. I mean, there have been people who have literally said they have seen people living wild, often described as being scantily clad or wearing nothing at all except for dust and dirt, and consuming wild animals, things like that. Now, digging into the history of some of that, I've actually found postings on social media where people have said, I had relatives and they grew up near the Great Smoky Mountains. And when they were kids, they would play pranks on people. They would dress like cavemen and run out there and try and scare people who would be hiking. And so I wonder how many of those stories of people living off the land, people engaging in, you know, very simple lifestyles away from humanity, off the grid, so to speak, how much of that might actually contribute to this mythos of there being wild people in the Smokies.
All right, I'm curious about the Bigfoot side of this.
Wait a minute, what?
When you and I talked in August, I asked you specifically about Fontana and if you were aware of any Bigfoot stories or wild man stories or anything from any of the communities that were around here. The answer then was like you didn't know of anything specifically. Does anyone know of anything relating to Bigfoot in this area from that time period? You know, wild man legends, any of that kind of stuff?
There's one specific story that I know that is really, really wild, and that was a friend of the family of our dad. Our dad was in a kind of like a garage band back in the day, and his drummer, Bruce, grew up out there in Madison County, and he says, you know, on his grandparents' property, one night, like right as the sun is starting to go down, there was this chicken coop up on the property. And he would just, you know, run around the property just checking stuff out when he was a kid. And apparently he goes up there towards the chicken coop and he says that he sees this thing that is very tall, covered in hair. And the one thing that he talked about that was like really specific is he said he remembered the hands on it, the fingers were really, really long. And he said that he saw it looming up over the chicken coop trying to get in there. And he did not describe it as looking like a man, like a person. It was humanoid, but it was, you know, hairy and had long, almost like sloth-like fingers is what he talked about. When we did an episode of our podcast about that, we started looking into the surrounding areas to see if anybody else had really talked about that. Now, his particular sighting was, you know, mid to late 1960s, but there were tons of people talking about stuff that they had seen and experienced, and the wood knocking and the very, you know, similar subsequent Sasquatch-esque and adjacent, you know, activity or sounds, calls being heard in the night. So maybe not directly here, but, you know, if they can cover the territory that we think they can, it's a stone's throw.
Just to add to that one a little bit, I mean, that is absolutely relevant to this region. The regionality of the issue, and again, I think, Jeff, you'd speak to this aspect of it, is something that's very interesting. So if there are creatures like that in this area, or if they range through this area, or ever did, stories like Bruce's are very interesting. We first heard that story when we were really young. And I remember maybe at age 13 or 14, Caleb's 3 years younger than me to the year, to the day, okay, born on my 3rd birthday. So we were kids. We go over there and we're asking Bruce, tell us, Uncle Bruce, about the Bigfoot. He says, well, I don't know. I never said a Bigfoot. For all I know, it could have been a crazy old man, but it looked like it was covered in hair. It was getting into the chicken coop. And what had happened was he was staying with his cousin at the time. And his aunt had said, go up there to the chicken coop, get eggs. I'm going to make biscuits and things for dinner. So it's just before nightfall, and they're going up at dusk, you know, and they're, right at sundown rather. They're going up the hill, and that's when they see what they initially think is a bear getting into the chicken coop. When they start making noise to get this thing to come out of the chicken coop is when Bruce says it comes up and out and stands up on hind legs, looks at them, and goes straight off into the forest behind them. And we talked with Bruce again just a few years ago, and I actually recorded audio from that discussion. And Bruce added to that, he says, I'll tell you something else. I went up there the following day, and he said you could see the literal path through the thick brush. And we're talking about thorns, laurel, a lot of really thick undergrowth. And he said, I followed that path for a good ways until it went all the way through a stretch of forest onto the other side where there was a cornfield, and then I chickened out. And he said, and I wouldn't go any further. But he said, I was pretty convinced that there was something large walking on two legs that we had seen go back through the forest after we scared it off that night. In the version of the story that he told us when we were kids, I remember him specifically saying that the most, specific feature I remember was the hands. He said, I remember thinking the hands looked crooked, and that the fingers were very long but looked almost crooked, and he says that it appeared to be dropping eggs, trying to hold on to what it had as it ran off into the forest.
Tangentially, I wanted to add that about the area. One thing that we try to do on the podcast a lot when we're doing our research is go for primary documents. And we were talking about this the other day. One of the problems with the TVA and the CCC documents from the time is there's half a dozen repositories for all of them now. They may be digitized, they may not. There's one in St. Louis, there's one in Maryland. So with all the mining camps, the logging camps, the CCC camps, there probably were people seeing something that they couldn't explain around here. I mean, this was a wildery area, and you're talking about thousands of people in the woods working. I mean, I'd love to be able to try to figure out how to mine those documents once we figure out where we can find all the CCA. I wonder if the TVA actually kept their own documents, which would probably be in Knoxville.
The thing about that too, Seth, is you have to think of corridors of travel is the thing. So Fontana Lake is massive.
Yeah.
So not many things when they're moving, and my theory, these things, if they stayed in one area like this cove, you're going to know way more about them. It's just common sense. So they're nomadic. So what I find in my research is they're moving particularly on the tributaries from, let's say, North Georgia up the Nantahala River Basin. They're coming basically up above Fontana, but below Fontana too, which would be Tennessee. But you have to remember too, you gotta have people to have a sighting. So people are usually on the lake, just on the lake in a boat going around. There are a few little reports that popped up this summer, but they never got back with me. Lady was in a boat. It's after there's an article in the paper here, so you have to kind of, you wonder if she just wants to get interviewed or whatever. But very rarely. But now, where you were at earlier, near Nantahala Lake, yeah, way more of that little lake. Not very popular. Half of that lake is like this one, where it has the Nantahala National Forest on the upper side of it.
There are very few recent sighting reports that I received, but back in the early 2000s when I was researching specific sightings, in fact, Dakota, you and I had looked into a few right across the Tennessee border. I'd been communicating with people on message forums through one of the major news sites there in the region, and I received a very interesting report from a man who had been a hunter, and this would probably have been, again, maybe 2 to 3 decades ago, but only an hour from where we are right now. And he said, my brother-in-law and I were up in this area, we were hunting, it was wintertime. He was on the adjacent ridge from me, and he said, and where I was in my tree stand, I hear something coming down through the forest, and so I'm getting ready, I'm thinking maybe there's a buck on its way down. What he saw was very much unlike any animal he'd ever seen. He said it was walking on 2 legs, and by all accounts it seemed to be an ape or a monkey of some kind. But he said it was walking on 2 legs like a man, slightly hunched over and swinging its arms. At some point, he said it seemed to have become aware that he was there in the tree stand. He says it looked in his general direction, seemed very startled, and then when it began to leave the area, the locomotion changed. And this is something that's fascinating about some of the East Coast reports, because he said it broke into a run on all fours, running, knuckle walking, almost like you'd see a gorilla do. And so he said that the creature left the vicinity very quickly like that. Well, he didn't know initially what to think about this or even whether to talk about it. And so he's coming out, and when he meets his brother-in-law and they're exiting the area, he wasn't going to say anything. And then the brother-in-law, first thing is, did you see that monkey? Did you see the monkey? Am I going crazy? And so they both had seen this thing. It's a very interesting report, and again, one of the most recent that I've temporally found, but also in terms of proximity to this location. And again, that's just an hour or so away from here, but also it's also describing this locomotion that is distinctly different from what many longtime researchers would call the so-called true giant of the Pacific Northwest, the very much a humanoid bipedal ape that we would recognize as Sasquatch.
As we moved through the woods and talked through sightings, patterns, and stories tied to this area, one thing kept coming up. The way legends evolve once they're told and retold enough times. Over time, stories get smoothed out, reshaped, and sometimes rewritten entirely. And that's something we've seen all over the country. Modern ideas being layered onto much older places, with origins assigned where they don't necessarily belong. Again and again, we run into a familiar pattern. Folklore created by white settlers or by later generations quietly getting traced back to native peoples. Indigenous traditions become catch-all explanations, used to give newer stories an air of age or authority, even when those stories don't actually appear in the historical record. In the process, genuine native histories are often flattened or replaced, reshaped to fit modern fixations, whether that's Bigfoot, UFOs, or whatever else happens to capture the imagination at the time. That's where our conversation with Caleb Hanks turns, because when you start peeling back the layers, some of these stories don't come from where people assume they do. And in this case, the legend often cited as ancient and indigenous, the Boojum, turns out to have a very different origin altogether.
One thing it's like a recurring theme on the podcast is you have all these legends and lore that it's like, these are Cherokee legends and everybody believes them to be Cherokee legends, but we have found out that a vast majority of them are not Cherokee at all. In fact, they are essentially just made up by, white folk that came into the area much later on, and we're trying to drum up more, just kind of interest and have a little bit of like enriching lore about the area. And as far as we can tell, the Boojum and the attributed, that being kind of, almost being a Sasquatch-esque creature, as much as that is in the lore in a lot of people's minds, because you have the Boojum Brewery out there in Waynesville, a lot of their, imagery is Sasquatch related. But as Micah knows a lot more about the actual history of it, we'll tell you, the Boojum is more than likely kind of a fabricated story by non-Cherokee individuals.
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on there. I think, if memory serves, that it had been Lewis Carroll who first used that term Boojum. And then, of course, the newspaper writer for the Asheville Citizen-Times, which there was two newspapers at one time, the Citizen and the Times, but John Paris chronicled a lot of stories from the region. He would write about the Brown Mountain Lights, and he also wrote about the Boojum. And you can still go, for instance, up around Sunset and some of the little communities up there, up around Lake Logan, the Episcopal Conference Center. There is a Boojum Trail, is the name of one of the roads, and then there's a Boojum Cave dance hall there on the property, and you go in there and there's this sort of a satyr-like creature, which is their depiction of the Boojum. And the stories were that he would bury his jewels in little pots and things at the base of trees. There's a whole myth that was built around it. As the sort of Sasquatch culture has come together, though, I think really you look at some of the popular television shows about Sasquatch and then bringing much broader cultural interest to this topic beginning in the late 90s and early 2000s. Then terms like Boojum and some of the sort of myth-making that began with articles by John Paris and others, it really gets appropriated. And what people essentially are doing is saying, well, we call our Sasquatch Boojum around here. Interestingly, though, you also have words like booger. This is a favorite of ours. And you have a lot of regional landmarks that are named Booger Hollow, Booger Hill. And a lot of what that has to do with is really dating back to the Prohibition era when people were moonshining. They would have their still up in the woods, and to try and keep people away from their stills, they would literally create stories about monsters in the forest. And they would tell these stories about these creatures to keep people from going near their stills. And so you still have a lot of landmarks that have similar names to Boojum, Booger, or Boogeyman. So it's very interesting how the etymology of all this really kind of works its way in. People may be describing what, again, to me sound like very similar stories of very real possible Sasquatch sightings, but these names get borrowed from other existing traditions.
The Cherokee stories tied to these mountains are older and more complex than most people realize. There are the invisible people said to live inside the mountains themselves, stepping between worlds and sometimes helping lost travelers. There's also a massive horned serpent tied to deep water and dangerous places where the land feels alive and watching. Other stories speak of the Raven Mocker, a dark wandering presence associated with death and the taking of life force. These weren't campfire tales meant to entertain. They were warnings, explanations, and ways of understanding a landscape that could be both generous and deadly. What's striking is how specific these stories are to place. Rivers, caves, ridgelines, and deep forest hollows. And what brings us to another tradition that's often mentioned more quietly, the stories of small human-like beings said to live underground or in hidden places. The day before this hike, we were shown something connected to those stories. A small human-like skull claimed to have come from a cave somewhere in the region. We weren't allowed to film it, and we can't say who showed it to us. We also couldn't determine whether it was authentic or connected to anything described in Cherokee tradition. But holding it, seeing it, was unsettling enough to remind me how easily stories like this blur the line between folklore, misinterpretation, and something much stranger. It's also important to acknowledge that not every story that shows up in Appalachia originated here. Some ideas traveled across the Atlantic with European settlers. Tales of little people, underground dwellers, and fairy folk that slowly emerged with local landscapes and over time were sometimes mistaken for native traditions. Stories migrate, just like people do. They mix, adapt, and change, especially in places where cultures collide. And that's why Fontana matters. When valleys are flooded and communities vanish, stories can disappear just as easily as houses and roads. I've said this 1,000 times, but one more won't hurt. If these stories aren't written down, recorded, or remembered, they sink beneath the surface, quietly erased. The lake didn't just cover land, it covered voices. In some ways, it feels like we're racing time itself, trying to capture what still remains before it's lost for good.
Are there stories that you've noticed traveled from Europe to here?
Oh yeah, quite a bit. I mean, it's the Fae are here, but they've been adopted. The Cherokee talked about the moon-eyed people, the little people of the mountains. That's the ghost lights in this area they attribute to them. Thomas Divide Overlook, which is Brown Mountain gets all the love. Thomas Divide Overlook has more ghost lights than you'll ever see at Brown Mountain, but it's not as famous. And that area also has some Bigfoot sightings, but that area, oh man, the ghost stories up there are amazing, and the lights there are incredible when you go. Now's a good time of year to go because the trees aren't quite covering it as much. Now, other European stuff that came over, there's a lake monster in Lake Junaluska. It's a freaking tasselworm from Norway. It's a giant cat fish. It's got a cat head and a lizard body or a fish body, and it comes out of the water and spits on people, all this stuff. And it's a man-made lake. It didn't exist till the 60s, but the river there, the Cherokee talked about this creature, and that was in that river. Now he's in the lake, and he's gotten bigger. So again, a European story came here, but it blended with a Cherokee story. So does that mean the creature wasn't here before then? No, it was here, just different name. Well, we started with the campfire tales all the way back. And we are all storytellers. We all collect stories, we tell stories, our family stories, our histories, our encounter stories. It's, oh, don't go in that house, it's haunted. Well, somebody was murdered there, so we don't go to that house anymore. It's a cautionary tales. So it started with the fireplace, it evolves, but the storytelling is still there. And we do it through documentaries. We do it through podcasting, our Eerie Travels podcast. I'm telling ghost stories. I'm talking to ghost people and Bigfoot people and UFO people. We're just telling stories around the campfire. Just now we tell it to the world.
Cherokee Little People. This is one that's pretty near and dear to me and my buddy Austin, because it's just something we always ended up talking about. But I think it was, Micah, maybe 2004 or 5 that we did our Bigfoot expedition here around the Canottie Fork Trail in Cherokee, North Carolina. So while we're out there, we're out in the middle of the night in the middle of the woods, and we're legitimately looking for Sasquatch. I think I was maybe 19 years old, but we get out on this trail in the middle of the night, completely dark. We're out there with flashlights and cameras. I think we were filming on high 8 at that point. But when we're out there, we're just kind of being quiet and seeing what, seeing if we hear anything. And after a little while, I started to notice that down in this valley, and keep in mind, we're like on out there in the woods, at least like a mile or 2 out up the Canottie Fork Trail, we start hearing this sound that sounds kind of like in this low, consistent drumming kind of sound. And I was like, do you guys hear that? And I couldn't tell if it was maybe like a body of water or something where like a log is getting hit, or there's just kind of like some sort of like acoustic sound that the water's making. But we sat there and listened to it forever, and for a lack of better explanation, it sounded to us like somebody's just out there in the woods beating this drum. So how this ties into the legend of the Cherokee Little People, Austin and I start this podcast, and we're, interested in it. We've heard a lot of stories. I've heard some firsthand. I'll share one with you. But apparently part of the lore of the Cherokee Little People is that if you're out in the woods in the middle of the night and you start to hear a drum off in the distance in the woods, they say don't follow it, because that is where the Cherokee Little People live. So I immediately see that, ears perk up like, well, I have heard that. That's odd. And so then I, immediately start thinking, well, gosh, did I, come in contact with these? Because I know multiple people that have had firsthand encounters with what they explain to be a Cherokee Little Person. And the one that sticks with me very much to this day was, there was an estate. It was like rental cabins that was owned by this guy named Johnny Caps. Unfortunately, he has since passed, but we were doing kind of like, like a Bigfoot hunt / just like, symposium up there, just everybody getting together, my brother and I and some associates, just kind of talking about the stuff. And I get to talking to Johnny Caps about, just whatever. And Johnny's just a very interesting character. He was born without a right hand, but ended up becoming like a star baseball player. He just like learned how to do it. And so he's kind of like a no BS dude. He's kind of lived through a lot of stuff in his life. And we just, are having a couple of drinks, and he says, I'm gonna tell you something, you're gonna think I'm completely nuts. And I was like, well, try me out, because I've heard a lot of weird stuff. And he's like, I was here at the house that we're sitting in right now. And he said, with the cabins, I go down on my golf cart and I go and I collect the trash and I bring it back up to the house. He said, I'm driving down the road. There's like a little paved road that gets down to the bottom of the cabins. He says, I drive down to the bottom and I'm about to get the trash cans. And he says, there is this little 3-foot tall man standing there. He described him as looking like a Cherokee Indian. And he said he's standing there leaning up against the stump with, and I quote, this little grin on his face, just staring at me. And he said, it scared me so bad. He said, I jumped in my golf cart and whipped it around and I haul ass back up to the house. And he's like, if you didn't think I was crazy, you're really gonna think I'm crazy now. He said, when I got up to the top, he said, I don't know if he had a brother or something that was playing a trick on me. He said that same little man was standing there waiting on me when I got to the top. He said, I ran in the house, I grabbed my 6-shooter, I pulled my covers over my head, and I waited till my wife got home, and I never came out of the house.
There was another friend of ours, our family, JR was his name. Yeah. JR was an associate of our parents, and JR had always been told about the stories of, is it Yunwi Junsti?
Well, as far as we can tell, it is Yunwi Junsti. Yeah. It's spelled kind of strange, so it's kind of hard to tell that that's the way it's said, but as far as we can tell, that's how it is.
That would be the indigenous Cherokee word for the, the tradition of the little people. Mm-hmm. And the general folklore that surrounds this, the idea is if you see them, leave them alone. Let them be, let them do their thing. JR had always heard these stories, and at the time he was living in this region, and he had several horses in the pasture behind his house, and he said, one day I walked out there, and I saw what looked like a bunch of kids on the back of this horse. And he said, I walked over and I was going to tell him, the kids, get off the horse, you know, you don't want to hurt yourself. And he says, as one turns and looks at him, it's obvious these aren't children. And he said, I just walked away and didn't say anything else. He said, I knew exactly what I was looking at. And JR was a really, again, no BS kind of a person. And it was always baffling to us when we were kids how you meet people like that who don't seem to have, you know, they don't tend to be people who are prone to exaggeration, but they're like, yeah, you know, we saw these little guys.
I thought the kicker with that story is he said when one of the kids turned around, he had a full beard.
He did describe facial hair, yeah, he did.
So.
Yeah.
Do you just kind of grow up with that lore surrounding you here? I mean, or is it something you have to seek out?
You know, so if you live in the Appalachian Mountains, you're inevitably going to be, you know, around the lore. You're going to hear the folk tales. Now, for people like us, we often seek these things out. And I know that for me, working in radio many years ago, I had an associate come through and he had asked me to join him on the reservation one night. And I'll never forget this. I was driving up over Smoky Mountain. It was snowing and there was ice on the road. And thank goodness I drove a four-wheel drive car at the time, but we were still slip sliding. We got up to the home of a woman named Wanda. And as we walked in, I mean, it was like going back in time for many reasons. I mean, there was a couple that lived there in town. They were obviously fans of, you know, country music, you know, from bygone eras, and they looked like they could have walked right off of an album cover from that era. And then there were also several residents there, indigenous residents on the Cherokee reservation. One gentleman who I spoke with a lot that night, he was an older man at the time, and his name was William. And William had said that in the 1950s he had been on a squirrel hunt on the Haywood County side of Smoky Mountain. When he said on this clear cut where they'd been doing logging, he started finding these huge footprints. And the way he described it, he said, great big footprints, no shoe, just like you or I. And so he said he followed these all the way up to the top of the ridge, and he had tried on several occasions to shoot squirrel while he was on that side of the mountain where the footprints were and couldn't get a shot. But he says as he comes over the other side of the mountain, the footprints were gone. And he says, I see two squirrel ran out on one branch and bam, got them with one shot. And so I asked him, I said, William, do you feel like the presence of the footprints somehow influenced the ability to shoot those squirrels? He says, oh yeah. And I asked him then, do you have a name or a special word for that creature? He says, oh yeah, we always called him Bigfoot. But he told me several stories that night about, there was another family named Crow that they said that they had seen an entire family of these things come down the mountain behind their home. Another family had also described a dog of theirs that was taken out of its pen one evening and killed, and they found nothing but just the hide. Whatever it was, it just ripped the hide right off of the dog. And then another story that was up around Water Rock Knob, which is again here in the region, they said that as they came around the corner, there was a large woolly man down in the road like he was looking for something, and as they came around and illuminated him in the headlights, he leapt up and in 3 steps was off the road into the brush and gone.
As we came out of the woods and left the Fontana shoreline behind, it became clear that what people like Micah and Caleb Hanks, Jeff Smith, Jeff Carpenter, and Dakota Waddell are doing goes far beyond simple entertainment. The conversations they're having and preserving give these mountains a voice. They keep stories alive that would otherwise fade, and they bring thoughtful perspective to places like Proctor and the communities lost beneath Fontana Lake, not just as curiosities, but as lived-in places that mattered. People like Mark Muncy help ensure that the legends and folklore of the region aren't reduced to caricature or lost entirely. And through decades of careful, often thankless work, historians like Lance Holland will be remembered as true keepers of memory.
And see, this is a rock cut where they blasted. They had black powder. They'd have to drill the holes.
People who made sure Western North Carolina wasn't forgotten simply because it changed. Today, much of that history lies underwater. When Fontana Lake filled, entire communities vanished beneath its surface. Proctor, Judson, Cable, Forney, Medlin, Noland, and smaller settlements scattered along Hazel Creek, Eagle Creek, and the Little Tennessee Corridor. Yes, this includes my family's own community of Needmore. Homes, schools, churches, stores, and roads disappeared. Some graves remained beneath the lake, their names known only through records, family memory, or not at all. Most graves in the Fontana Basin were relocated before the lake filled, and sources note that only some cemeteries are actually under the lake's waters. For example, the Judson Public Cemetery and Delosier Cemetery are commonly cited as being under Fontana Lake. What's harder to state with certainty from public records alone is which specific individuals are still submerged today. That said, the TVA cemetery data set includes many entries for the Fontana Reservoir Project marked not moved, meaning the TVA never did relocate them. Among the names listed that are believed to now be buried beneath the lake are a handful of people with the last name of Crisp. The Crisps are connected to my family through marriage, so this might be yet another example of my own work colliding with my family's past. Some of those names include Charlotte Cable, Barton Cable, James Clyde Cable, Wiley Cable, Riley Cable, Ed Crisp, Gladys Crisp, Billy Crisp, Jim Crisp, Alan Crisp, Jane Jenkins, and Francis Jenkins. What survives now are fragments, photographs, stories, foundations glimpsed when the water drops low, and a stretch of pavement that ends abruptly at the road to nowhere. A physical reminder of promises unfinished and histories interrupted. It's impossible not to feel the weight of what's been lost, but it's also impossible not to recognize what remains. Our history endures because people choose to carry it, and as long as someone is willing to listen, to document, and to remember, nothing is ever truly gone, no matter how deep the water gets.